Thanks everyone for joining us. We're excited to present this new tool for quickly and easily obtaining data on IMF surcharges. So put simply, surcharges are junk fees imposed by the International Monetary Fund on its most indebted borrowers and hitting countries when they're already at their most vulnerable. In recent years, the burden has fallen largely on developing countries that have been negatively affected by multiple external factors: the pandemic, war, climate crises, and increasing interest rates in the US and other developed countries. So, to give just one example, over the next decade, we estimate that Ukraine will have to pay nearly $3 billion in surcharges. Now, before I turn it over to my colleague Ivana to walk through the new dashboard, I'm just going to give a brief explanation of how surcharges work and sort of where the current debate around reforming this policy stands. So the current iteration of the IMF surcharge policy was instituted in 1997. And there are two factors that trigger the application of surcharges. One, if a country's debt exceeds a certain threshold to the IMF, and then the second one is a time threshold, so if it's outstanding for 3 or more years. Now, right now, a typical IMF loan will carry an interest rate of around 5%, but with surcharges that can quickly increase to 8%. And that might sound a little bit small, but it actually can add up quite fast. And over the last couple of years, there's been a huge increase in the number of countries that are paying surcharges, from 8 in 2019 to 23 this year. And that we estimate over the next decade, these countries will pay the IMF some $13 billion in surcharges, money that very clearly could be far better spent on real development needs. Now, CEPR has been at the forefront of the call for the elimination of surcharges for at least 3 years now. And happy to say we've been joined by a growing coalition of well-known economists, civil society organizations, and others in this fight. In 2022, the U.S. House of Representatives actually passed legislation requiring the IMF to review its surcharge policy. And in fact, a review is ongoing now, and hopefully we can get to a little bit more of the scenarios from that process a little bit later on. Now, what we've been arguing for has been the complete elimination of surcharges, which we found are counterproductive, unfair, and unnecessary. So one of the main reasons the IMF argues that these are important is that they incentivize timely repayment and reduce reliance on the fund. Through our research, we've really found no evidence for these claims at all. And in fact, if anything, adding to a country's debt burden, especially when it's at a very vulnerable moment, has made it more difficult to achieve timely repayment. And this is the fact that the IMF has, in fact, recognized in the past. So while the current policy dates to 1997, it is not the first time the fund has had a similar such policy. One was instituted in the 1980s, only for the IMF to later conclude that rather than incentivizing repayment, it actually exacerbated the problem. And as a result, that policy was eliminated before then coming back here in this latest iteration. So there is also precedent for the total elimination of surcharges. Now, second, the IMF argues that surcharges are necessary so that it can increase and maintain its lending capacity. But again, this simply is not the case. And we've done a lot of research around this and done a number of blog posts and reports sort of documenting the numbers. But the reality is that the IMF's precautionary balances has actually already been met this year. And according to its own estimates, even if surcharges are completely eliminated, the fund would remain above target in future years. So it's quite clear that the surcharges are not necessary for the IMF to maintain this threshold at all. So we released a dashboard with all this data on surcharges sort of compiled in one place because we're approaching a critical decision point. The IMF is currently reviewing its surcharge policy, and we're expecting a decision in the coming weeks ahead of the fall meetings, which are due to take place again middle of this month. And so that sort of will wrap up my portion here, and I'll hand things over to my colleague Ivana, who was instrumental in putting this together and has been doing a lot of the surcharge work at CEPR for a lot of years now, to walk you through the data, and then we'll have a brief Q&A at the end as well to answer any questions that are outstanding. Thanks.
Thank you, Jake. All right, I will just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Great. So, right, this dashboard shows both historical and current data on surcharges. And we're hoping that it will be a resource and a tool for easy data lookup, and that it will demonstrate, just how much of a burden surcharges have become all around the world. And so I'll start with the beginning. Sorry, my computer is loading a little bit slowly. In this first section, we have countries that are currently paying surcharges in 2024. And so you can see on this map in red, we have the countries that are surcharge payers. There are 23 of them this year. And in blue, we have the countries that are at risk of paying surcharges in the future, meaning that their credit outstanding, their debt burden to the IMF has increased close to the threshold. And so from this view, you can hover over a country and you will see a little summary of their expected surcharge payments over the next 10 years. And these are CEPR estimates and their credit outstanding to quota ratio. And as Jake mentioned, countries begin paying surcharges when their credit outstanding reaches 187.5% of their IMF quota. And so for a country like Egypt, for example, whose ratio is 500%, this means that they're paying surcharges on most of their debt to the IMF. And this is also the case for countries like Ecuador, whose ratio is over 900%, Argentina also over 900%, and several others. So here you can click on a country from the map to get more detailed data on their average annual payments below and their total estimated payments for the next 10 years. And you can also select a country from this filter. So either of these options will show you the details. And to the right, we have a table with our estimates for surcharge payments in the next 10 years in order of the highest payer. So in the next section, we have the historical surcharge payments if we scroll down. And so here we have data starting in 2004. And unfortunately, this is the earliest year for which the IMF has shared surcharges data. And so on this bar chart, you can see how much surcharges each country has paid each year. So you can hover your mouse over a bar and see the country. And this view is also reflected in the table to the right. So right now, we're looking at emerging and developing economies. And you can see that, over the past 10 years, their surcharge payments and the number of countries have increased significantly. From here, you can also filter to look at a specific country, let's say Ukraine. And the bar chart will show you their payments, and they will also be reflected in the table to the right based on your selection. So as you can see, Ukraine has been paying surcharges at very high levels for many years. From this view, you can also select a different income group. So instead of emerging and developing economies, we also have advanced economies. And you can see that a number of European countries were paying high levels of surcharges during the financial crisis and continued to pay them even after the crisis. So we have, Portugal, Greece, Ireland here. And if you would like to go back and clear the filters, you can click on this button, Reset Filters, and that will show you all countries over time that have paid surcharges and their totals to the right. Now, I hope I didn't go too fast, but I think we can move on to questions and answers now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ivana. So I guess, one thing to start, I was hoping we could get Andrés here, who's joined us, to talk a little bit about the options for reform that seem to currently be on the table with the IMF's review of the policy.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for having your interest in surcharges. The surcharge review started this year after a lot of pressure from civil society and also many countries at the IMF. And of course, there's always the structural differences between the debtor countries and the creditor countries, or net creditor countries. That is the main point of difference and tension at the fund. But now there's also a new element, which is the surcharge paying debtor countries, which are usually middle income countries, and those that are more low income countries that because they have access to other IMF funds like the PRGT, which is the Poverty Relief and Growth Trust Fund, are not necessarily paying surcharges as they have access to the concessional loan fund. Now, the discussion at the IMF right now is how we can improve the situation of the system as a whole, but also of the economy of the surcharge paying countries, but also of the borrowers in general. So there appears to be three variables on the table right now. One of them is to increase the threshold for when surcharges apply. The exact number for the application of that threshold will differ according to how we see this evolution of surcharge quotas, or the quotas applicable for surcharges. Some have said that it should go back to 300%, which was a threshold that was around in 2016, while others claim that it should be aligned with the exceptional access threshold, which is at 435%, and even has been raised just recently temporarily to 600%. Of course, that would make sense because if you have to pay these extra fees, it might make sense when you request a very large loan. The second variable that's being analyzed is the actual rate for the surcharges, which is divided into the size-based and the time-based surcharges. And there seems to be a conservative proposal to only very slightly reduce that rate, while our math that we've done at CEPR shows that you could really reduce that substantially without affecting the record-breaking profits that the IMF has had over the last couple of years, based precisely on surcharges. And then the third variable is what's called the lending margin, which is an extra bit of interest rate that is charged to the loans in addition to the SDR rate, which is sort of the standard rate at which the IMF mostly covers its finance, its funding, and also its loans. Now, that extra small rate right now is at 100 basis points, so 1 percentage point, and there's discussion about lowering it. Why? So that not only surcharge paying countries are benefited from the current review, but that in general, all debtors to the IMF are benefited from the sort of relief that's about to happen. We think that it is reasonable to increase that lending margin as well. And as a reference, we can consider that only a few years ago, only a couple of years ago, that the SDR rate was at 0.05%, and the lending margin was at 100 basis points, so 1%. And the lending margin was 20 times greater than the SDR rate. Now the situation is the opposite, where the SDR rate is 350 basis points, so 3.5%, but the lending margin is still 100 basis points, or 1 percentage point. Now, it would be totally reasonable for that lending margin to reduce to the level at which the SDR rate was set a couple of years ago, that is 5 basis points. and it would still mean record profits for the International Monetary Fund. So as you see, there's a lot of number crunching going on, but the important point is that these alternatives are on the table now at the IMF. It is expected that before the fall meetings, there will be a decision made, and it will be announced by the IMF managing director either right before or at the fall meetings in Washington, D.C. These will be good news, but we hope that a conservative position is not taken, but one that is the closest to the complete elimination of the surcharges is the one that is approved, because there is really no sense in keeping with these policies. As Jake mentioned in the introduction, there are historical precedents for the complete elimination of the surcharges, so there should be no excuses to go forward. In terms of the IMF's own balance sheet and its finances, it is at a very robust position right now because of the previous profits that it's had over the last few years, precisely because of these large debtors that have paid a bunch of surcharges to the fund. Their finances are very well suited for this, to the point that the IMF over the last 24 months has approved what's called an augmentation, which is a euphemism for basically hiring hundreds and hundreds more people, an increase in its pension obligations and benefits for its employees. So we see that there is definitely a wide enough margin to get rid of these surcharges, or at least make a very substantial cut to these extra fees that countries in problems are having to pay.
Thanks, Andres. I guess sort of one follow-up question to that is, what happens after the policy change, right? If it is a conservative thing, I mean, will there be more opportunities to push for greater reform? Is there, further efforts that are possible from IMF member countries, or sort of, is this the sort of final big push we're in right now?
It was hard enough to get the IMF to undergo a review. It really took a while. There was not any specific surcharge review procedure established at the IMF. It was either treated as an issue that had to do with precautionary balances or as part of the budget in general. Now I think they want to make it a more periodic element, but what is likely is that the next review won't happen for at least a couple of years. And 2 years with very high interest can make an entire economy go broke. So we really hope that a conservative viewpoint is not the one that prevails here, but one that actually can try to even undo some of the damage that has been done over the last few years.
Great, thanks. And so moving back to the data itself in the dashboard, Ivana, I was wondering if you could explain. I mean, I know it's based some on the IMF's own data around surcharges as well, but also sort of unique estimates that CEPR's put together. So maybe you could just talk a little bit more about sort of the process of putting that together.
Sure. So there is one difference between CEPR's estimates of future surcharge payments and what the IMF publishes. So when the IMF publishes surcharges data going into the future, they're actually only basing it off of the loan amounts that have already been disbursed to a country, which means that, if a country has agreed to $1 billion loan, but has only gotten the first disbursement of, let's say, 200 million, then the IMF will project surcharges based on only that first portion of money received. And so their projections are actually, in some cases, quite drastically smaller than what the country will actually end up paying as they get the future disbursements. And so what we do at CEPR is we estimate surcharges on the full life of the loan. Because, in 90% or more cases, I think a country that has an IMF agreement will get these disbursements. And so in that way, we feel that these estimates paint kind of a more accurate picture going into the future. And so those are the estimates that we include for the current surcharge paying countries in 2024 and going forward in the dashboard. And then the second part of the dashboard, which is based on historic data, is showing exactly the IMF's reported historic numbers.
Great, thanks. Well, I don't think there are any other questions from folks right now. So we can go ahead and wrap this up. And I just want to thank everyone for watching and for learning a little bit about surcharges, and urge everyone to check out the dashboard and play around with it and see the countries that are actually paying these exorbitant fees over the next decade, and also to check out all of the other work that we've done. This has been a huge topic at CEPR over the last number of years. Reports around the history of them, the historical precedent that we've been talking about here, more specifics around the effects on developing countries that these surcharges have been. And it's all right there on our website, CEPR.net. Just do a search for surcharges and it'll all be there. So thanks again. And yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.